For November 26, 1996, Biography with Jack Perkins.
He loved art and music, attended the finest medical universities in his country. He took the vow to heal the sick and to enter no house except for the good of his patients. That's what he vowed. What he did was torture, dehumanize, and slaughter people until he had become known as the Angel of Death. It was Germany, World War II, and he was Josef Mengele, the doctor who sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths in Nazi concentration camps. Camps where he conducted cruel and inhumane experiments. Later, he became a Nazi war criminal on the run. Tonight, in this world premiere biography, we look at the man, the controversy, and the mystery that has always surrounded the Angel of Death, Dr. Josef Mengele.
What system could have created a man like Josef Mengele, a medical doctor held responsible for selecting over 400,000 people, mostly Jews, for extermination in the gas chambers of Auschwitz? A man who conducted the most bizarre and painful experiments on twins, hoping to unlock the secrets of multiple birth, to genetically create the Aryan super race that would rule the world for 1,000 years to come. To attempt to understand the paradoxical personality of Mengele, to unravel the malignant mystery of what made him function, one must view the world as it was on March 11th, 1911, the day life was bestowed upon the Angel of Death. Newborn Joseph's fatherland was on the verge of the Great War. It began in 1914. Joseph's father served in the war on the Western Front. And Joseph's mother, Walburga, managed the family's small farm equipment business and raised her three sons, Joseph, Carl Jr., and Alois. Joseph was the oldest, named for his maternal grandfather. The war ended in 1918 with the defeat of Germany, followed by the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, which stripped it of most of its possessions and its military might. But the work ethic of the German people was not extinguished, and within a few years, a new nation was rising. Karl Sr. returned from the war and began to rebuild his company in Günzburg until it became the largest employer in the area, and the Mengeles, though not really old money, were the first family in that scenic Bavarian city and respected by all, a respect that continues to this day, in spite of the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, who was a native son. Karl Mengele spent little time on the factory floor in management, but rather remained upstairs inventing all sorts of machines for the farm, ones that would chop fodder, shred beetroot, cut chaff, spread dung. In some ways, he was not unlike his firstborn son, who years later would be at home all alone at night in the laboratories of Auschwitz, bending over his microscope, whistling a familiar tune, lost in the passion for his ghastly research projects. By the mid-1920s, Germany was becoming the cultural cauldron and scientific center of the world. Medicine and music flourished, and Berlin was considered to be one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, surpassing even Paris. New concepts of how the human race evolved were being announced and embraced by great universities. Charles Darwin was oft-quoted, and a science called eugenics, the study of genetic breeding, was causing a stir. Later, all of this would become the focal point in Josef Mengele's life. He knew at an early age the family business was not for him.
Mengele's father was an autocrat. When he would come to the factory, he would come shouting. He was a very stern, authoritarian person. And Mengele's mother was cut from the same mold. She was a devout Roman Catholic, very strict, hard disciplinarian. Mengele got the feeling that he had to do something special to win their approval. It was not a warm, loving household. schoolboy friend remembers that even in school, Mengele would talk about how he had to do something great, how he had to achieve something academically to prove himself.
Although the Mengeles were very wealthy by Günzburg standards, the factory employed almost 1,200 people. Their children went to public schools. First, elementary, then to the gymnasium, if you had academic aspirations. Josef Mengele did. A classmate remembers.
An extraordinarily ambitious student. He always wanted to do something outstanding, to be a great scientist. Julius Diesbach, gymnasium student.
Another school acquaintance called him aggressive and very patriotic. By 1930, Mengele enrolled at the University of Munich. He drove there in his own white automobile. He studied hard, but also enjoyed the good life. Tobacco, beer, ballroom dancing, and military finery. Munich was once again a political hotbed, and Josef Mengele became an ideologue after hearing Hitler speak about the superiority of the German race. Many students were swept up in this movement. Heredity and eugenics were oft-heard words in the scientific community, who for the most part backed Hitler and his mystical concept of the German folk, the folk who would not survive if parasites like the Jews were allowed to go unchecked. Anti-Semitism was gaining momentum. The medical community seemed to approve. Hereditary purity, euthanasia, sterilization of undesirables, and the prospect of racial superiority through eugenics preoccupied the scientific community. Eugenics became a most sacred word.
This term, eugenics, was coined by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in 1883. It means literally good genes. And everybody at the time knew that you could breed animals in a certain way to get certain traits. And what Galton wanted to do was apply these principles to humans, to say, okay, look, we have obviously in society very successful people and sort of not so successful and very unsuccessful. Surely some of this is due to breeding, to genes, something to do with our biology. In Germany, it gets picked up in particular by a guy named Ernst Haeckel, and he takes Darwinism and turns it into social Darwinism. So Haeckel gives the politics a scientific flavor by saying, look, there's good biology to prove why the German people are a superior people.
No one embraced this notion with more sincerity than young Josef Mengele. In 1934, he joined the Nazi Party, but continued with his studies, receiving his doctorate degree in philosophy and passing examinations for medical school. He moved to the University of Frankfurt and began research under the tutelage of Professor Ottmar von Verschuer, an ardent Nazi and top specialist in the science of eugenics, which would attempt to create the master race. While studying with von Verschuer, Mengele wrote a very acceptable paper on genetics and children, which was published. And like his mentor, he became fascinated with the study of twins. In the southeast of Poland, the gates of a place called Auschwitz were creaking open for Josef Mengele, where he would find twins in great abundance. Twins who would have no choice but to participate in his deadly genetic experiments. But Auschwitz is at the end of a long road, and Josef Mengele will wait several years before he becomes the angel of death for over 400,000 defenseless men, women, and children.
Biography's look at Josef Mengele will continue here on A&E.
Only by going alone in silence can one get into the heart of the wilderness. All other travel is mere dust and hotels and baggage and chatter.
This is no ordinary toothbrush. This is the Braun Oral-B Ultra. Clinically proven to remove plaque better than an ordinary toothbrush. Dentists say change your toothbrush every 3 months. We say change it forever. The new Braun Oral-B Ultra.
Now is no time to discover your ordinary flashlight isn't working.
Come on, Snake Light, and rescue me.
Now you need the Auto Snake Light. Plug it in or run it on batteries. Be prepared. The Auto Snake Light. Very clever, Black & Decker.
This year, more fathers and sons will spend Saturday mornings together. More couples will celebrate golden wedding anniversaries, and more friends will get to know each other a little better. State Farm is pleased to announce that last year, almost 2,000 fewer people were victims of drunk drivers because programs like Designated Driver are working, but we still have a long way to go. Please, be a good neighbor. Be a designated driver.
Things a mess. Feeling stressed. Put it down and make it neat. Touch it. Retouch every beat.
P-Touch electronic labeling system.
Our biography of Josef Mengele continues here on A&E.
The transition from magic to medical science was a gradual process that lasted for centuries. Medicine first became a healing art in ancient Greece and was celebrated by the ancient Greek physicians with an oath to their mentor, the great Hippocrates, the father of medicine. His oath is said to this day with great solemnity by graduating medical doctors. It is held sacred. It is difficult to imagine that once Josef Mengele spoke words like this.
The regimen I adopt shall be for the benefit of my patients, and not for their hurt or any wrong. I will give no deadly drugs to any. Whatsoever house I enter, there will I go for the benefit of the sick. Dr. Josef Mengele.
But he did speak them, and the Hippocratic Oath was held with deep reverence by German doctors. And yet, somehow, into this great arena of culture and scientific growth that was Germany, black magic in the form of anti-Semitism and concepts of life unworthy of life were being added. A strange duality of being seemed to exist within the Nazi Party and Germany.
The enigma of Nazi Germany is that it was such a highly developed, cultured civilization. How could Auschwitz come out of that, out of Bach, out of Goethe, out of this high culture? And the answer is because stamped in the human biology is the capacity for hate, for violence, for murder in all cultures. Everybody has the capacity for that.
And the great factories of Germany belched forth smoke day and night. The economy prospered, and science and the culture continued to flourish. How could such evil come from this?
Precisely because of the culture, precisely because of all of the characteristics that made Germany culturally creative, that made it disciplined, that made it economically productive. It's precisely those elements of it that led to the society engaging in wholesale genocide. You needed a science to be able to create the Zyklon B that could kill 2,000 people at 1/2 of 1 cent a person. You needed engineers who could design crematoria, architects who could design concentration camps. What Nazism teaches us is that a man can cry at music and remain absolutely unmoved by the murder of children.
Josef Mengele is now a member of the elite Waffen-SS, an organization that attested to the racial purity of its members, preferably traced back 4 generations. Such purity was also required of their brides. Josef Mengele was in love and had asked Irena Schönbein to be his wife. He would later say,
"She was beautiful and well educated. She was the love of my life."
When he decided to marry Irene, there was some question about her background. There was apparently a child born out of wedlock in her ancestors, and Mengele had to write some sort of document to overcome any talk that this relative might have had some Jewish blood. And he married her somewhat to the dismay of his parents. The family was Roman Catholic, and she was a Lutheran, which did not sit well with the family.
Who could suspect then that the handsome groom, whose non-Aryan good looks were marred only slightly by the gap in his upper front teeth, would one day become the most sought-after Nazi of all time, with a total reward of $3.4 million placed on his head for crimes against humanity? Mengele completed his obligatory military training with his elite SS group in the Tyrolean Alps for several months, and then returned to research in Frankfurt, where he and Irena lived in a handsome house near the Main River. The attractive couple were often seen strolling together and enjoying their city and the feelings they shared. In September of 1939, the Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, began, and Poland fell to the Nazis in less than a month. As long as the war continued with swift German military successes, Mengele remained with Irena and continued his biological genetic research. But with war on 2 fronts, Germany had attacked Russia. Mengele and his unit were mobilized and moved into the Eastern Front. He was a frontline combat doctor.
He sees combat on the Eastern Front. He's wounded. He's decorated. So, I mean, he becomes quite the Nazi hero. He's an MD. He's a PhD. He has numerous decorations for valor, for being wounded, and so on.
Mengele had been awarded the Iron Cross First Degree, Iron Cross Second Degree, plus the standard decoration for service on that front. When his wounds were healed, he was declared unfit for further combat duty and volunteered for duty as a Lagerarzt, camp doctor. Why would someone so highly qualified in his type of research choose to go to a place like Auschwitz?
Twins. He does his experiments on twins. Look, imagine what it is in the city of Berlin. How many twins can you study? And how many of those can you kill? Here he has 250 sets of twins at his disposal. Do with them as you might, all between the ages of 2 and 17, 2 and 18, whatever he wants to do with them.
One of the duty assignments for camp doctors was to alternate their time and meet the incoming trains carrying their unfortunate Jewish cargo to their final destination. These doctors had the power of life and death, and would indicate in which direction the people should be taken. One way was to the gas chambers, to an instant and horrible death. The other was to slave labor. Often there to greet them was Dr. Mengele, who was looking for his Zwillinge, twins. Most of the people at Auschwitz called it Annus Mundi, anus of the world. But to Mengele, it was his paradise of research. Soon he would be renowned as the great doctor who had unlocked the very secrets of life itself.
Biography's look at Josef Mengele will continue here on A&E.
It was just one of those nights, just one.
Ways he was looking for his twins.
I will describe to you my personal arrival there. The train stopped. and we heard a lot of Germans yelling orders outside. Surrounding the camp, as I looked outside, were these enormously tall barbed wires. Everything looked gray. The smell of the air hit you immediately, that stench of burned flesh. But my mother did grab my twin sister and me by the hand, and we just stayed in that place frozen. She didn't budge. I realized that my two older sisters and my father disappeared in the crowd, and I never ever saw them again. An SS was running up and down the platform and kept yelling in German, Zwillinge, Zwillinge, which meant twins. Stopped by and looked at my sister and me and demanded to know, are they twins? And my poor mother didn't know what to say. And she hesitantly asked, is that good? At which time the SS nodded yes. And my mother said, yes, they are twins. My mother was pulled to one direction. We were pulled in the opposite direction. And as I looked back, I saw her with her hand stretched out.
Eva Kor never saw her mother again, and Dr. Josef Mengele's collection of human guinea pigs for his deadly experiments continued to grow. Mengele sent the results of his experiments to his mentor, von Verschuur, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Every shipment was given top priority as Mengele raced against the clock to find the secrets that would create the pure Aryan race. Time seemed of the essence as the war was turning against Germany. His interest in the blonde, blue-eyed specimen as a role model was curious, since neither himself nor his superiors looked even remotely that way in their physical appearances. Mengele was fascinated with blue eyes and was said to have a collection of human eyes on his walls that resembled a butterfly collection. And he constantly tried to change the color of the eyes of the children.
Why would somebody change the color, want to change the color of someone's eyes, unless you had the image that the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan beast was somehow the superior, and those of us who have brown eyes or green eyes or other color eyes somehow are inferior. And consequently, Mengele's experiments fit into a context of the eugenics movement.
Every morning there was mounting tension amongst the prisoners as well as the doctors and the SS when the word went out that Mengele was coming to make his rounds.
Everybody was so scared, and the terror that the supervisors had in their voice made us scared. And finally Mengele came with his entourage, this elegant-looking gentleman who was like the ruler of the universe, walking in and looking around, and actually began counting us. He was dressed immaculately. He had, on occasion, he had gloves on his hand and that little riding stick, and he would count. He would count his guinea pigs. The relationship between a subject and a master, it's a very difficult relationship to explore, and I am not fully sure that I can quite understand it.
Mengele knew the effect he was having on the women and coldly calculated his manner to produce the desired result. Gisela Pearl, a Jewish doctor and prisoner, remembered.
He delighted in coming before us, smelling of perfumed soap, so elegant, so handsome, his shirt that beautiful blue color. There were girls who would say to me, Kissy, I would love to spend the night with Mengele. It was another way to drive us insane. You had to be insane to smell the crematoria and see him as an attractive man, one to spend the night with.
At other times, his darker side would spill forth unchecked, and his rage was deadly. A survivor once saw Mengele shoot a 17-year-old in both knees because the boy was trying to steal a lump of coal. Then he grabbed him by the hair and blew his brains out with his pistol. "Stealing is verboten. You must respect the laws of this place." Then he calmly made his exit. Except for an occasional visit, Irena Mengele had not lived with her husband since he chose Auschwitz. The location was too distant and uncosmopolitan for her. It is questionable that she understood fully the extent of his crimes, and that he remained faithful to her is doubtful.
I know cases where when the transport came to Birkenau, he picked out during the selection the most beautiful girls, Jewish girls, entertained them all night, and in the morning he shot them.
In Paris,
Mengele was an accomplished pianist. This is an actual recording of him singing and playing. He would often entertain his guests in this manner, and the sound of the music would drift eerily over the death camp until dawn. Was Mengele mad, deranged in some way? Or had the quest for unlocking the genetic secrets he sought destroyed any sense of human conscience as we understand it? Opinions differ.
Josef Mengele was the personification of the demonic evil of the Nazi regime. He has become, and justly so, a symbol of Nazi evil. It is impossible to read the West German indictment of Mengele, which graphically describes the scope of his crimes and details many of the specifics, without being overwhelmed by his monstrousness.
Most important thing is to see that Mengele's conscience operated as a scientist, who said that to really do good science, you have to be concentrated on it and disciplined on it. You can't play games, you can't short circuit, and you need the experimentation.
I really don't think that Mengele was deranged. I think that Mengele was a scientist that justified what he was doing. We were injected 3 times a week with about 5 injections at a time. We have no idea what those injections were.
He injected all manner of substances, including phenol, chloroform, and gasoline, into their veins, sometimes directly into their hearts. He killed his experimental subjects to perform autopsies. He performed vivisections, that is to say, live dissections of living human beings, which of course killed him.
Deranged or not, Mengele's days of experimentation were coming to an end. The Russian winter was approaching, and with it, the Red Army advanced toward the death camp. On November 26, 1944, former chicken farmer Heinrich Himmler, now head of the German SS, telegraphed all camp commandants and ordered them to dismantle the death works. Josef Mengele's odyssey from Auschwitz to a life of tortured freedom would soon begin. Before the dismantling of the death camp began, Mengele made his final selection, and with his usual calm, efficient manner, managed to send 461 of the 509 arriving people to instant death. It was one of his last services for Auschwitz. With the sound of the Russian army drawing ever nearer, Mengele began to gather up all of his records. and on January 18, 1945, the Angel of Death disappeared from Auschwitz forever.
The experiment after the Nazis disappeared, so to speak, stopped. So I am assuming, no, I have not seen Mengele after that. I would say the last time we saw Mengele might have been late October or early November. He didn't say goodbye.
One of the greatest acts of eluding capture in this century was about to begin. Mengele had ditched his SS uniform and secured regular German army officer attire, then talked his way into joining a retreating field hospital unit as a doctor. The convoy moved to the south. Finally, in May of 1945, Germany surrendered. Mengele ended up in 2 different Allied POW camps and was finally released. He passed the quick scrutiny of his captors for a number of reasons.
He lacked the blood type tattoo that the SS gave to most of its personnel. That blood type tattoo was used by the American forces in determining who was subject to automatic arrest for service in the SS.
There is no documentation as to why Mengele did not have the SS tattoo, but former SS prison doctors have confirmed that he did not. Another event of luck for Mengele was the urgency with which the Allies released millions of regular German army POWs. Mengele slipped away in the crowd. Using an alias and the support of his family, Mengele worked on a farm in the Rosenheim area near his hometown of Günzburg. From 1945 until 1949, he was visited by his wife Irena. She was no longer happy with their situation, even though she had presented him with a son. Rolf Mengele was born in 1944, the result of one of his mother's visits to Auschwitz. War criminal lists were being circulated by the Federal Republic of Germany. SS doctors and other SS officers were being brought to trial. Mengele was frightened and asked Irena to leave Germany with him. She refused. Disappointed, but determined, Mengele fled to Italy in 1949. Soon after, he boarded a small freighter and sailed for Buenos Aires. Mengele felt secure about Argentina because of the pipeline called Odessa, a secret organization which offered a conduit for former SS members. The presence of many German communities was reassuring, and parts of South America even reminded Mengele of Germany. Some of the mountains seemed like Bavaria itself to him. Mengele felt at home living in this attractive residence in the Florida section of Buenos Aires under the name of Helmut Gregor. Then, in the early 1950s, it seemed to him that the hunt for war criminals was over.
So Mengele took his own name back. He was employed by the Mengele Farm Implements Company there in Argentina. He was even listed in the telephone book. His father, Carl, even visited him there in Argentina and informed him that Irene wanted a divorce. She wanted to marry somebody else.
He agreed to the divorce. What could he do? It was strictly a legality put on paper. Irena was free. In Argentina, Mengele continued with his life. When a lawyer who represented the family interest informed him that the German government had sent letters to the government in Argentina requesting the extradition of former Nazis, like Mengele. Mengele was panicky, and with the help of people who said they would attest to his residency for 5 years, he fled to Paraguay. And in 1959, Jose Mengele was given citizenship. Paraguay was under the rule of General Alfredo Stroessner, of German descent, and another great admirer of the Nazis. He offered Mengele the haven of the Paraguayan law, which stated that no citizen could be extradited. A new citizen of Paraguay, Jose Mengele, though nervous, felt secure enough to be seen in the streets of Asunción. Then, in 1960, a thunderbolt struck. The Israeli secret police kidnapped former SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann from Argentina and took him to Israel to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Eichmann had been in charge of the Jewish section of the Gestapo and handled all deportations to the camps. Mengele felt unsafe in Paraguay. Even before the news of Eichmann, he had felt uneasy and went further underground. The Mossad was on his tail.
Isser Harel, the former head of the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, who was the head of the Eichmann apprehension mission, has said publicly that their other target at that time was Mengele, but that he got away.
The result of what the Eichmann trial would be was becoming clearer and clearer to Josef Mengele. Eichmann was sentenced to death by hanging, and conscience or not, Mengele felt a noose tighten around his own neck. He set out on his final journey to Brazil to live the rest of his life underground. No longer the angel of death, but by most reports, a frightened, lonely, and aging man on the run.
Search the biography.
From the moment Mengele left for Brazil in 1960, his mystery began to grow to almost mystic proportions. For the next 25 years, from 1960 to 1985, a cottage industry of Mengele sightings and pursuits began. During those decades, he was seen by seemingly reliable sources, including the U.S. Department of Justice, Simon Wiesenthal, and the Israeli Mossad, in a plethora of places and living in conflicting lifestyles. He used many aliases and borrowed and doctored many IDs. Among them, such names as Jose Mengele, Helmut Gregor, and Wolfgang Gerhardt were used. He was aided and abetted by the Odessa, led by Luftwaffe ace Hans Ulrich Rudel, who assisted other Nazi war criminals, including Klaus Barbie. 2 works of fiction were written about him, The Boys from Brazil and Marathon Man. Both were made into major movies. All of this only furthered the growing infamous and mystical reputation of Mengele. Also, it truly interfered with the genuine search that was going on for him by the federal government of Germany and the governments of Israel and the United States. Already, the bounty on his head had swollen to $3.4 million, which included rewards from Germany, the Wiesenthal Center, and Israel. A staggering sum, but it never produced Josef Mengele. Then, in June of 1985, a news story broke that sent shockwaves around the world. A grave, supposedly belonging to one Wolfgang Gerhardt, was exhumed in Embu, Brazil, and the remains, a skull, some clumps of hair, assorted teeth and bones, and fragments of clothing, were said to have been in the ground since 1979. And the forensic teams concluded that they were the remains of the Angel of Death from Auschwitz, the most wanted Nazi of all time, Josef Mengele. If this was correct, then what was the story of how Josef Mengele lived and died from the time of his flight from Paraguay in 1960 until the time of his reported death in 1979?
In Brazil, he was put in touch with a pair of Hungarian refugees, Geza and Gita Stammer. They were anti-communists, relatively sympathetic to the Nazi movement. They had fled to Brazil after the war. They agreed to take Mengele in as a boarder. They did not know his identity. They were told he was a Swiss named Peter Hablechet, and a small farm was purchased out in the boondocks of Brazil. Even so, Mengele had a tower built on the place where he could climb up there and scan the countryside to see if anyone was coming for him.
Mengele spent an uneasy 16 years with the Stammers, which included a move to a larger farm near Sao Paulo, Brazil, again purchased by the Mengele firm in Günzburg. In 1976, living conditions had deteriorated with the Stammers to the point that another family was found to take him in. Wolfram and Lieselotte Bossert were to become Mengele's host and hostess to the reported end. He seemed to enjoy his boat building, and he enjoyed the Bossert children. His dread of being captured continued to grow, and he slept in a small bedroom with a Mauser pistol by his pillow. He was not living the opulent good life that many thought. Life was closing in on him. He was buoyed by a visit from his son Rolf in Sao Paulo in 1976. Later, Rolf would say in an interview with Bunte magazine,
"My father always maintained that he had done nothing wrong at Auschwitz. He said he selected people for labor, and that was all. I hated what he had done, but he was my father. I wanted to believe him."
If the evidence uncovered in 1985 is to be believed, then 1979 was to be a fateful year in the life of Josef Mengele.
In 1979, the Bosserts took Mengele on an excursion to a beach about 50 miles from Sao Paulo. Mengele went wading in the surf. He was in up to his waist, and he suddenly disappeared. He had suffered a stroke, fallen beneath the waves, and drowned. By the time they pulled him out and dragged him to the beach, he could not be resuscitated.
Lieselotte Bossert arranged for Mengele to be buried in a cemetery in Embu, under the headstone which would bear the name of Wolfgang Gerhardt. And there he would remain until the hurried exhumation in 1985. The forensic experts from Israel, Germany, and the United States entered the scene. The remains were sent to a DNA expert in England, who managed to secure a low-grade DNA sample for comparative purposes.
That DNA comparison was delayed for several years by virtue of the refusal of Mengele's widow, Irena, and his son, Ralph, both in Germany, to give us blood samples.
Therefore, I went to Germany and protested with 3 other twins, including my twin sister, and protested in front of the Mengele factory. And I said simply, we had to give a lot of blood in Auschwitz. How about Ralph giving a drop of blood for the sake of DNA study and truth?
Finally, the German authorities pressured Rolf and his mother Irena to provide the requested blood samples. And ultimately, they relented. The DNA test was performed.
The DNA analysis alone concluded with 99.9 certainty that the man who was buried at Embu, Brazil, was the biological father of Ralph Mengele.
In 1992, the Department of Justice, complying with a request from the Attorney General of the United States, issued 2 highly detailed volumes entitled In the Matter of Josef Mengele. The report concluded that the United States had never had a relationship with him, that after painstaking research and forensic examination, the department determined that the remains found in Brazil were, in fact, those of Josef Mengele. The governments of Germany and Israel announced their agreement with this conclusion. The matter of Josef Mengele was officially closed. Many people will never be satisfied with the manner of his death, or even the reality of it. There seemed to be no sense that justice had been fulfilled.
Mengele's dying the way he did violates our sense of justice. If we think of Mengele dying, we'd like him to die of cancer, limb by limb, organ by organ, after acute, great, terrific, painful suffering. Instead, Mengele dies by drowning, may have had a stroke and drowned. Period of time, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Even if he knew what was happening at that moment, the suffering's over.
Dr. Gisela Perl, a survivor from Auschwitz who had studied medicine in Germany, said,
I know that all of the medical students were instructed on the Hippocratic Oath. It was like a page from the Bible, that document. And Mengele, he made a dirty piece of paper of it.
Indeed, Josef Mengele had once spoken the sacred words of the Hippocratic Oath.
Now if I carry out this oath and break it not, may I gain forever reputation among all men for my life and for my art. But if I transgress it and forswear myself, may the opposite befall me.
The angel of death, the medical madman of Auschwitz, had become death itself.
Another excerpt from that 1992 Justice Department report to the Attorney General says the fact that the Auschwitz angel of death was allowed to perpetrate his crimes and then to die an old man's death in Brazil is evidence of failure. And it was a failure that allowed Josef Mengele to walk the earth the rest of his life, a free man. Wednesday on Biography, Nostradamus, many believe this 16th century half-doctor, half-magician, predicted some of the most frightening events in history. The rise of Hitler, the assassination of